Imagine this: you survive war. You escape your homeland with nothing but your family and the clothes on your back. You finally reach America safe, free, a place to start over. But at night, it isn't safe at all. Because when you close your eyes, something follows you. You wake up screaming, heart racing, certain that if you fall asleep again, you'll never wake up. And then one night, you don't. This isn't the plot of a horror movie. This really happened. And it's the terrifying true story that inspired A Nightmare on Elm Street. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're pulling back the curtain on the terrifying real events that gave birth to Freddy Krueger. When Wes Craven sat down to write A Nightmare on Elm Street in the early 1980s, he wasn't inventing his villain from thin air. He was taking inspiration from a string of real deaths of young men, healthy and strong, who mysteriously died in their sleep. Many of them had warned their families beforehand that they were terrified of their dreams. Doctors had no explanation. Families were left traumatized, and communities lived in fear of something they couldn't understand, a nightmare that killed them. To this day, scientists don't fully agree on what caused it, but one thing is certain: this phenomenon, real and terrifying, became the seed of one of horror's most iconic monsters. To understand how this nightmare began, you have to step back into the 1970s. Southeast Asia was in chaos. The Vietnam War was ending. In neighboring Laos and Cambodia, war and genocide tore entire nations apart. Millions were displaced. Among them were the Hmong people, an ethnic minority in Laos who had fought alongside the US in what came to be called the Secret War. Recruited and trained by the CIA, thousands of Hmong men fought and died. When America pulled out, the Hmong were left behind. Many were hunted down, killed, or forced to flee into the jungle. Families carried children on their backs as they crossed rivers and mountains. They survived on whatever they could find, often with no idea where they were going. Many ended up in refugee camps, sprawling, desperate places in Thailand, before eventually being resettled in the United States. By the late 1970s, Hmong families were beginning new lives in places like California's Central Valley, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. They took jobs in factories, sent their kids to American schools, and tried to rebuild their lives. But trauma like that doesn't just go away, it stays with you. And then something started happening, something so bizarre that no one, not doctors nor community leaders, could explain. Young men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, began dying in their sleep. The first cases slipped under the radar. A death here, another there. Healthy men, gone overnight. One Hmong refugee, who had only been in the US a few years, was described as hard-working and vibrant. But one night, he jolted awake screaming. His family rushed to his side, but within minutes he was gone. Autopsy? Nothing. His heart had stopped. Doctors wrote unexplained. His family whispered cursed. Another man, also in his 20s, told relatives that something was chasing him in his dreams. For nights, he refused to sleep. He drank coffee, tried to keep himself awake. But exhaustion always wins. When he finally collapsed into sleep, his family heard him cry out. By the time they reached him, he was already gone. Over the next few years, it happened again and again. One by one, more than 100 young Southeast Asian men in America died in their sleep. Doctors started keeping track. The press picked it up, but the families already knew. They were living in fear. Word spread fast through the refugee communities. At Sunday church gatherings, people whispered about another son gone. At grocery stores, mothers warned each other, "Watch your boys." Parents stayed up all night, sitting quietly in dark living rooms, listening for any sound from their children's bedrooms. Some families described horrifying final moments. A son gasping for breath, clawing at his chest as if something sat on it. Another thrashing violently, as though wrestling an invisible attacker. One screamed so loudly that neighbors ran over to help. But by the time they arrived, he was dead. Men stopped sleeping. They drank cup after cup of coffee, chain-smoked cigarettes, played cards all night. Anything to stay awake. But exhaustion always wins, and when it did, death often followed. Autopsies showed nothing. No poison, no trauma, no brain damage, just a heart that had mysteriously stopped. Doctors gave it a name, SUNDS, Sudden Unexpected Nocturnal Death Syndrome. But the name was just a label. It didn't answer the question that haunted the families. What was happening to their sons? In Southeast Asian culture, there's an old belief. When you sleep, your soul leaves your body. If it doesn't return, you don't wake up. Some called it the Dabtsog, an evil spirit that presses on your chest, suffocating you in your sleep. Others believed angry ancestors, spirits left unhonored after fleeing war, were punishing the young men. Combine this with trauma, years of war, flight, refugee camps, and the nightmares weren't just dreams. They were visions of real horrors they had lived through. Soldiers kicking in doors, neighbors executed, families running for their lives. So when a son screamed in his sleep, it wasn't just a nightmare, it was a memory. And for those who believed in spirits, it was also a death sentence. This belief deepened the terror. Many in the community were convinced something had followed them across the ocean, something that could cross the barrier of dreams. And the chilling part, for some, it did. By the early 1980s, SUNDS wasn't just a community secret anymore. Newspapers were writing about it. One Los Angeles Times headline read, "Healthy refugees, young men dying in their sleep." It was around this time that filmmaker Wes Craven read about one particular case that disturbed him deeply. The story was about a young boy, a refugee, who told his parents he was being hunted in his dreams. He refused to sleep for days. He drank coffee. He hid pills in his room. He begged them not to force him into bed. Finally, exhausted, he couldn't fight it anymore. He collapsed into sleep. Hours later, his parents woke to the sound of screams. They ran into his room and found him thrashing violently, his eyes wide with terror. By the time they reached him, he was gone. Craven later said this story chilled him to the bone. It became the seed of his most famous creation, Freddy Krueger. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy is supernatural, a scarred killer who stalks teenagers in their dreams. In reality, the killer was something no one could see. Doctors eventually tied SUNDS to rare genetic heart arrhythmias, particularly something called Brugada syndrome, which disproportionately affects men of Southeast Asian descent. Under extreme stress, trauma, or even fear, their hearts could suddenly stop. But this didn't explain everything. Why did it strike so suddenly in the 1970s and 80s, right after resettlement? Why did so many victims describe nightmares before their deaths? Psychologists pointed to trauma. These young men had lived through unimaginable horror. Their nightmares weren't fantasy, they were memories. And that stress, carried into sleep, may have triggered their hearts to stop. To this day, SUNDS remains a mystery. Cases are still reported in Southeast Asia. And in Hmong communities, fear of nightmare deaths still lingers. For Wes Craven, the true story of SUNDS became the foundation of a Hollywood horror classic. But for the families who lost sons and brothers, it wasn't a movie. It was real. Freddy Krueger may be fiction, But the nightmare that inspired him is not, because sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding under your bed. Sometimes they're waiting in your dreams. If you want more terrifying true stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below. Do you think SUNDS was medical or something darker? And if you thought this story was chilling, wait until you hear the horrifying true events that inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'll see you there.